Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. I'm Carolyn Miller with the Alabama Department of Public Health. Thank you for joining us today for our program, Elevated Lead in Children, the Potential for Harm and Our Response to the Problem. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email address are on your screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts, sign-in sheet, and evaluation are all available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access those materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses and social workers for this program. In order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, CE credit will only be awarded for 1 year for nurses, expiring on August 31st, 2020, and 2 years for social workers, expiring on August 31st, 2021. If you are watching this program on demand and want to receive a social work CE certificate, you will need to complete the social work test and send it in along with your sign-in sheet and evaluation. If you are watching this program live, there is no social work test required. For social workers, if you are watching this program live, it qualifies for classroom hours. If you are watching on demand, it is considered non-classroom hours. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our presenters today. Stephen McDaniel, Program Director of the Indoor Air Quality Lead Branch of the Bureau of Environmental Sciences, and Sarisha Johnson, Program Director of the Alabama Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. And joining us later in the program is Shanda Wilkins, who is a Senior Social Worker with the Pike County Health Department. Welcome to each of you. I know you have a lot of important information to cover today, so let's go ahead and get started with your presentations. And now I'll turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Carolyn. So glad to be here to discuss information that's so important to Alabama and reduction of lead exposure to children in Alabama. So we're going to get started with elevated lead in children and discuss some things that we do with environmental services. So our primary duties with Indoor Air Lead Branch, that was a mouthful earlier, is that we provide information on issues related to indoor air quality and mold, lead-based paint, and other lead hazards. But our primary focus is the Lead Hazard Reduction Program, and this is where we enforce regulations under the Lead Reduction Act of 1997. Now, this law, the Lead Reduction Act of 1997, enabled us to establish rules that require individuals and firms that do any type of lead work, whether it be lead identification, risk assessment, planning, design, lead abatement, or renovation projects, that they be lead-based paint trained and certified to perform these established safe work practices. And this is for all pre-1978 homes with lead-based paint and child-occupied facilities. So this is a slide showing our current territories that we have for lead certification. You can see our representatives throughout the state, and when you're working with lead and with this program, these are some of the individuals you'll be working with statewide. What objectives we're going to have for today with environmental? We're going to try to determine and let you learn what lead is, where it's found, why are we concerned about it, what's the big deal, and how we can be exposed to lead. But the two key points we're going to try to make is there's no safe way to do-it-yourself method to remove lead-based paint, and lead poisoning is preventable. So what is lead? Lead, it's a chemical element. The Latin means plumbum or plumbob. It's a heavy, soft, malleable metal used heavily in paints, as you see there on the slide. Where is lead found? It's found naturally in the Earth's crust. It can be found in many places throughout the United States and the world due to activity of burning in fossil fuels. As you know now, We have, you see when you go get gas, unleaded gasoline. Mining and other manufacturing operations uses lead. But it can be found in all parts of the environment due to all this lead being used nationwide. So it can be found in the air, the soil, the water, even inside our homes with the lead-based paint. So after what you just heard, is this like a response where people can, raise their hand, or is this, okay? Can you name some materials in a house that may contain lead?
Mini blinds.
Mini blinds, very good. Paint. That's excellent, and especially with the picture that's on the screen. Paint is the number one, lead poison, item in Alabama. So looking at the house, knowing that lead is an issue, this is the key point I want everybody to take away from the environmental side of this presentation. There is no completely safe do-it-yourself method to remove lead-based paint. So if you can't do it yourself, what do? Well, with our abatement and renovation rules, we recommend hiring a lead-certified firm to perform all renovations within a home that have lead-based paint. And once that's done, maintain those painted surfaces. Keep everything in good repair. Use lead-safe practices when you're working around lead paint. If you're a homeowner or a tenant that lives in a home that's pre-78 that has lead-based paint, make sure you mop the floor and use damp wipes around windows and doors at least twice a week to remove this lead dust that could be coming from deteriorating lead paint. Wash children's hands before they take a nap, after they play, before they eat. Clean the toys that the children play with. Wash pacifiers in warm soapy water regularly. And if you've got those low lying windowsills in your home, place some furniture in front of those windowsills to reduce or restrict access from children to chew on those windowsills. So, we are the lead certification branch. We have rules and regulations and laws regarding lead-based paint, but that wasn't enough. What we were seeing is that we needed some better methods of outreach and education. So this year, we started a marketing campaign. We started a marketing campaign through print media, through gas pump topper advertisement, and public radio. And the reason being, we wanted to reach parents and contractors to let them know about the concerns around lead-based paint and the requirement of the law to be lead-based paint certified. So this is an example of one of our print media ads. Where our print media went into was to go into local magazines, the Parent Magazine, the Journal Magazine, River Region Magazine, all the magazines that are really locally sourced here in Alabama had a lead ad this year and going into next year. And we were focusing on those parents, trying to get them to understand that these are some reasons to prevent lead poisoning in children. So you can see with this ad here, it actually specifically states 8 reasons why you should hire a lead-safe certified renovator. We also put these ads in local trade magazines. This was one that was in for the magazine for the Alabama Social Work Conference for this year. Here's some examples of our gas pump toppers. So when individuals pull up at a gas station to fill up their tank, they can see the little advertising gas pump topper on top of the gas tank, talking about exposure to lead-based paint and the risks that are there. We also targeted contractors at those same gas stations saying, is your firm lead paint certified? And our catch slogan is renovate right. We want everyone to do the renovation in accordance with the law and to make sure they're practicing those safe practices that we discussed earlier. So we put these gas pump toppers in high-risk areas and target areas throughout the state where we felt like we weren't getting much coverage with our lead certification through our licenses, and also in high-risk areas where our elevated blood levels were the highest. Why are we doing all this? Well, lead is highly toxic. You hear about a lot with children, but lead is toxic to everyone. And where we look at it, as far as like at the top right corner of this slide, lead in the workplace, all the contractors that work around this lead-based paint, they have to, use those safe practices not only to protect the environment, the family, the homes they're working on, but themselves as well. So we see lead-based paint in the workplace, lead in water, lead in paint, and again, those dangers are extremely susceptible to children and pregnant women. So routes of exposure, going back to the children and that hand-to-mouth activity, that's why a lot of the precautions was to wash hands, keep children away from areas that have active deteriorating paint or paint chipping in those areas. That hand-to-mouth and ingestion is the way they're getting that lead in their body. Our workers that work around the lead-based paint homes for this lead certification program, they get it through breathing it in. This could be through the industry that's working around lead, any type of welding, battery reclaiming industry, but also with construction, around lead-based paint, because it still is an issue with industry using lead-based paint. And then finally, that exposure from the mom to that unborn child. So what's the big deal about lead? Why is it such a toxic? Because it accumulates in the body. I mean, it's not something that if I had, some lead in this glass of water and I drank this water, it's not like something my body's going to get rid of. If I keep drinking water that has lead in it, my body is going to accumulate that lead in the body. So that's why it harms the body, because it just accumulates over time. And I'm going to have a little video here to show you nationwide how bad the lead problem is. And that should play.
Over the past century, the pandemic of lead poisoning, a corporate collusion to extract immense profit from the sale of a poison, cast a shadow over the planet, leaving in its wake death, disease, and crime. In the 1960s, during the peak of the pandemic, hundreds of children in cities across North America died every summer from lead poisoning. Dr. Needleman found that the amount of lead in children's baby teeth, which is a good measure of a child's exposure to lead, predicted how well they did in school. Children who had higher levels of lead in their teeth were more likely to be hyperactive, impulsive, low-functioning, and distractible. To show how lead exposure increases the risk for ADHD, let's look at two schools, each with 100 students. In the first school, students have low lead exposure. About 5 have ADHD. In the second school, students have higher lead exposure. 13 children have ADHD, 5 from lead poisoning. If we apply these numbers to the entire country, about 3 million children have ADHD. By eliminating lead exposure, we could prevent 600,000 cases of ADHD in the United States. The levels of lead that increase the risk for ADHD and other types of brain damage are exceedingly low. In 2012, the Centers for Disease Control and the World Health Organization declared there is no safe level of lead in children's blood. This shouldn't be surprising. Even though the body burden of lead has dropped by over 90% since the peak of the lead pandemic, it is still 10 to 100 times higher than our pre-industrial ancestors. Lead toxicity doesn't only impair children, it affects people over their entire life. The ability to think and reason increases as we mature, peaks during young adulthood, and then begins to decline in our 60s. Children who have higher lead exposure never reach the same peak ability as children with lower exposure. At the other end of life, adults with higher lead exposure have accelerated decline in their mental abilities and may develop dementia sooner. In a Cincinnati study, young adults who were more heavily exposed to lead during their childhood were more likely to be arrested for violent crimes. These results are mirrored in homicides over the past century. Children's exposures from lead and paint and gasoline are reflected about 21 years later by higher rates of homicides. Violent crimes declined dramatically over the past 4 decades in lockstep with the decline in blood levels. Over 50% of the decline in violent crimes was due to falling blood levels. All other factors, like poverty and the number of police, only accounted for 30% of the decline. Lead is also a risk factor for coronary heart disease. That's when your heart is slowly or suddenly suffocated by an obstruction of the arteries feeding the heart. In a national study, we found that deaths increased sharply at blood levels below 50 parts per billion, the level considered safe. There was no threshold or safe level. If we let the narrowing of this coronary artery represent the risk of dying from heart disease, you can see that most of the narrowing occurs below 50 parts per billion. We found that lead accounts for about 185,000 deaths every year. That makes lead the leading cause of fatal heart attacks in the United States. Beginning in 1892, about 20 children in Queensland, Australia were lead poisoned every year. About half of them died. After years of failed attempts to educate parents to change their children's behaviors to avoid ingestion of leaded paint, a pediatrician, A.J. Turner, said, "Prevention is easy. Paint containing lead should never be employed where children are accustomed to play." Despite this warning, the paint industry continued to add lead to paint. 2 decades later, when the lead industry was poised to add tetraethyl lead to gasoline, Yandell Henderson said, "The use of lead would cause vast numbers of the population to suffer from slow lead poisoning with hardening of the arteries." Still, the U.S. government allowed companies to add millions of tons of lead to paint and gasoline. The lead industry knew it was toxic, yet they mounted a major campaign to deceive the public. The first crime? Failing to prevent the lead pandemic, despite the early warnings. In the 1940s, paint companies reduced the amount of lead in paint because it was needed for World War II. After the war, the petroleum industry expanded the production of leaded gasoline. They couldn't help themselves. It was too profitable. The second crime? Immense wealth at the expense of public health. You may recognize some of the corporations who profited from the sale of lead: Standard Oil, Dutch Boy Paints, DuPont, Sherwin-Williams, and General Motors. In 1967, Rene Dubois, a scientist, warned, "The problem is so well defined, so neatly packaged, with both causes and cures known, that if we don't end this social crime, our society deserves all the disasters that have been forecast for it." Still, the lead industry continued to add lead to gasoline, paint, canned foods, water service lines, and other consumer products. Ultimately, over 12 million tons, or 11 billion kilos of lead, was disseminated into the environment, the equivalent of over 100 Chrysler buildings. A toxic residue of lead now lingers in our cities and neighborhoods and continues to poison children. The third crime. Once lead was declared toxic in affluent countries, corporations increased sales to industrializing countries. Now, over 90% of children who are lead poisoned live in industrializing countries, especially in Southeast Asia and Africa. Why does the lead pandemic deserve to be the crime of the century? It isn't only because it was the largest mass poisoning in history, exposing billions of people to a toxic metal, or that the lead pandemic was entirely preventable. It isn't only because immense wealth was made by a few at the expense of people's health, or that it is a leading but largely ignored cause of violent crimes and heart disease. The ultimate reason lead is the crime of the century is because the perpetrators of this horrific tragedy were never held accountable. In the absence of a global treaty to ban all non-essential uses of lead, countries around the world are taking steps to protect children. Denmark banned all non-essential uses of lead. The Philippines and India banned lead-based paints. The city of Rochester tests houses for lead hazards before they are rented to families with children. Cities in California sued paint manufacturers to help reduce lead hazards in housing. Lansing, Michigan replaced their lead service lines. It won't be easy, but if every city and country took these steps, we could eliminate lead poisoning in the next generation.
So with that video, I was really hoping it would be able to play for this presentation, because it really puts into perspective how important and deadly lead is, how long it's been around, and it's still a problem today. So, you know, just with this live training that we're having right now, we are trying to network. We're working as partners, as you'll see in the video and continuing presentations, that we do a lot of things together, because that's how we're trying to fight this lead problem in Alabama. It's a nationwide problem, and then, you know, even our long-term goals and plans have fallen short of, you know, preventing or eliminating lead in Alabama. And so it's going to be a continuing problem. It's going to take more and more people working together with the mindset that it is a preventable disease, but it's also one that is everywhere in Alabama. So what are some things that we do regarding our environmental services and with this lead program? We're not going to know where to go with environmental assessments or to help with any other programs unless these children are being tested. So lead poisoning can only be confirmed through direct blood testing. And, you know, even though CDC has lowered that level and reference value to 5 micrograms per deciliter, you saw in the video that there is no safe level of lead identified in humans. So, you know, we rank our counties with our partners with EPA based on poverty, housing stock that's pre-1978, number of children under 6, and so we've got some really big hot spots in Alabama that we try to focus our attention on, and those are also areas where we see some of the higher elevated blood level reports when we get those in. So we work with, you know, the case managers in each county health department when we get these cases, and we work directly with those counties trying to help, you know, determine the sources of lead in these homes. So with all what we've seen in Alabama, our primary source of lead, and even though we've named a whole bunch as far as gasoline, paint, and other imported materials, our number one cause of lead poisoning in Alabama is from lead-based paint. So with the lead-based paint, you're looking at any house built pre-1978 could have lead-based paint. Even though it was banned in '78, there's still you know, millions of houses nationwide that have lead-based paint in them. Lead-based paint is still manufactured and used in industry, painting bridges and water towers. So inadvertently, sometimes, you know, individuals that are in repair and maintenance, you know, get a, you know, gallon or 5-gallon bucket of lead-containing paint and use it at their school or other places, because it's very durable. It lasts long. It holds up to the weather. So it is still available out there, but you can't use it on child-occupied facilities and, you know, homes with children. So lead-based paint does deteriorate over time, and this is due to moisture, normal wear and tear, and disturbance during renovation. So that's why we have our lead certification program. So when lead gets worn, it flakes. Or lead paint, it flakes and chips. It does deteriorate into dust. You can't see it. It's not like something you can do the white glove test and see it. So we have special wipes when we come out and do an environmental assessment, that we wipe an area and we send it off to the state laboratory for analysis, and they determine there how much lead might be on that surface. And lead not only is an issue, you know, when it's in good condition, it can be, you know, encapsulated or enclosed and still cause some issues. But some ways that we try to look to prevent lead-based paint exposure is to cover it up, encapsulate it with a thick approved encapsulant for lead-based paint. It's almost like a tarish type paint, covering up with an enclosure, such as it's an exterior surface, covering up with vinyl siding, but most importantly, to maintain it with non-lead-based paint and keeping it clean. So here's what an example of an alligatoring pattern is on a lead-based paint house that's not being well maintained. You can see those chips are readily accessible to be picked off and eaten or cause environmental exposure or contamination. Same thing on this window sill. We do a lot of homes where we do elevated blood level surveys where they've enclosed a port or something that used to be exterior where we find lead-based paint that now has lead-based paint on their inside. And you can see those window sills are right at the height of a child where they can either pick and chew that window sill and have direct access to lead-based paint. Same thing on the floor. You got lead-based paint on this door. It can get into the carpet, and those children that are crawling around, they're getting it on their feet, their knees, their hands, anywhere where they're crawling where this lead dust could be located. It could be just lead paint on the outside, but you could still have lead dust on this window area inside where this child is sitting. Here's a child actively picking off a paint chip on the exterior part of the house. Children like it. It has a sweet taste to them. They'll eat it like candy. Here's a little lead paint chip out in the soil. So when the children are outside playing, they're coming in contact with lead-based paint and other lead in the soil. So what can you do? Test the paint. Replace the paint if it tests as positive for lead. Cover over this lead-based paint. And if it's necessary, strip the item or remove it from the home. Lastly, use a lead certified contractor. Whether it be renovation or abatement, the only way to safely remove lead is to make sure you hire a lead safe certified contractor that is trained in the safe practices in lead removal. And that's it.
Thank you, Steve. Now we have Suresha with us to talk more about testing and elevated lead.
Yes, hi, thank you. So I'm going to cover a little more from the clinical side, cover the objectives we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about lead poisoning, what is it, and what are our current recommendations for testing. And then we're going to discuss the factors, of course, that place children at higher risk for lead poisoning and discuss some of those health effects that Stephen touched on earlier that can occur from lead exposure. And then he's covered a good bit of it, but we're going to talk more about environmental sources of lead and the measures that can be taken by individuals to actually prevent and manage those lead exposures in and outside the home. So first and foremost, historically, lead poisoning was thought of as a subset of symptoms that were caused by the absorption of lead into the body. So typically, in the past, when people thought about lead poisoning, they thought about the fatigue and the abdominal pain, maybe some nausea and diarrhea, loss of appetite, anemia, maybe some paralysis or weakness, and in extreme cases, possibly seizures, coma, and death. But today we know that even at low levels, there is damage from lead being absorbed into the body. So the Alabama Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention Program observes the CDC's recommendations to follow up on any child with a blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter or higher. Now understand that even as we follow that, we recognize that even at levels below 5 micrograms per deciliter, there is still a possibility that damage is already being done. But again, we have aligned with CDC and their recommendations for testing and follow-up. So first and foremost, and you'll see some overlap here, but lead poisoning can only be confirmed through direct blood testing. And that can be done with 2 types of tests. You can do a venous test where you draw a little bit of whole blood out of the arm, or it can be done with capillary testing when they do a little finger stick and get a few drops out of the finger. But there are some important distinctions that need to be made with these 2 tests. With venous blood lead level testing, it is more definitive. It is considered the most useful and diagnostic test for recent or ongoing exposure. Capillary is much easier to collect. However, it is more easily contaminated. Capillary is what we see a lot of for annual lead screens that are done on small children because, again, doctors can do point-of-care testing in the office and immediately get a result that they can share with the family. But again, that contamination can really be an issue, and a lot of times we see false high results because of that. The key thing with either type of test, it's important that a confirmatory venous test is done if a blood lead level is 5 or above to confirm and validate whether we truly have an elevated blood lead result or not. So our recommendations for screening, and it varies across the U.S., but in Alabama, we have determined at this point that we want to encourage universal screening. And what this means is that every child should have a routine blood lead screen done at 12 and 24 months of age. If a child is between 3 and 6 years of age and there's no record of a blood lead screen being completed, then we ask that pediatricians or providers go ahead and do at least one blood lead screen on that child to see that they're not already being exposed to lead. More importantly, we have a wonderful network of case managers in Alabama, our care coordinators, that follow up on all of our children with elevated blood lead. So anytime we have a child with a reported blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter or higher, we make a referral for case management services to the care coordination system, and then they begin follow-up, which will involve education. It will involve, I guess, a preliminary home assessment where they'll go and really look for any obvious signs of lead in the home and then offer recommendations regarding that. In addition, if we have a blood lead, let me jump back, a confirmed blood lead level of 15 micrograms per deciliter or greater, we also make a referral to our environmental services. So that's where Stephen and his team come in. And they will also go out to the home in conjunction with the care coordinator and do additional testing. So there's actually lab testing attached to that the care coordinator would not do alone if it was less than 15. And to clarify, when I say confirmed elevated blood lead level, it is confirmed when you have one venous or 2 capillary screens within 12 weeks of each other that are 5 micrograms per deciliter or more. So confirmed just has to do with it being either a venous or 2 capillaries done in a particular time frame. So that all said, Medicaid also encourages blood lead screening, and that is part of the early and periodic screening, diagnostic and treatment appointments, which is the EPSDT, and that is specific, again, to Medicaid-enrolled children, and it requires the same, a 12-month blood lead screen, a 24-month blood lead screen, and if a child is between 3 and 6 years of age and has not previously been screened, then a child should be screened at that point. So I'm going to get into this for talk a little bit about this. I've got 2 tables I'm going to show you. The first table here is the recommended schedule for obtaining a confirmatory venous sample. This comes straight from CDC. Again, we align with all of CDC's recommendations. Again, historically, we had I guess I would say a set timeline for doing testing. But when you look at this, it's set up more as a sliding scale. So the higher the result, the more urgent for the test. So if most of our children that have elevated blood lead, when we get that first capillary test, they are typically 5 to maybe 15, a lot of 5 to 9s. So for those children, they have up to 3 months to do another test. And that again, while we encourage venous, it could be capillary. We strongly encourage venous because anytime it's elevated, you always have to ask, is that specimen contaminated or is this a true elevated blood lead? On the flip side, if you get one that is 45, you'll see here that we want to complete additional testing within 48 hours. And we actually, even though I was not here for it, we had one happen last week where we had a small child that had a 45 and they had to really work to get that child back into the doctor's office very quickly for that follow-up venous test. So while we don't see those very often, it does happen. The most important thing with this is that the level is considered when you determine when that follow-up test is going to be done. So you don't want to just assume that you're going to do every test at 1 month or 3 months out. That higher that test, the sooner you want to get that child back in. Now, once you've done that and you've confirmed you have an elevated blood lead, you're going to work off a different table. The important thing to note with this is that once you've confirmed an elevated blood lead level, all testing should be done with venous blood. Again, you want to make sure you're doing that ideal diagnostic test so we know we're getting accurate results, not a contaminated capillary result. So with the venous blood lead, again, it is set up on a sliding scale, but it is slightly more complex. CDC laid it out, so in the early testing, you're going to be testing more frequently. And that is the first 2 to 4 tests after the blood lead level has been confirmed as elevated. Once you have seen 2 to 4 tests beginning to decline, you see them trending down, then the testing intervals can be spaced out a little bit. And that's where you'll see that change up, where like for 5 to 9 micrograms per deciliter, for the first 2 to 4 tests, you'll want to test every 3 months. But after you see a trend in that blood lead level declining, that's at least 3 results that are going down, then you can begin to space that testing 6 to 9 months apart. And again, obviously, when you get to a certain level, you'll want to test as soon as possible. Tell you what, we'll stop there and talk about this. Something I don't actually have in a slide, but I want to talk about what we do in our program and why we do it. Stephen has touched a little bit on why it's important that we are addressing elevated blood lead levels. Everything we do in our program is designed to break the exposure pathway. So with the exposure pathway, you've got 5 pieces to that. Your first piece is your source of contamination. In Alabama, it's usually the lead paint in the home. The second one is your environmental medium or your transport mechanism, and that's that deterioration that's occurred, and now you've got that lead dust on the floor. And then, of course, your third is your point of exposure, and that's the child's hands or the toy or whatever item actually transports that from outside to inside the body. And then, of course, your route of exposure, again, since we're talking about children, typically is going to be that hand-to-mouth exposure where their hand or the toy or the pacifier they dropped on the floor now goes in the mouth. And then you've got to have that exposed population. If you notice, most of the things that Stephen talks about with the lead paint is the fact that it's not used in child-occupied facilities or in homes where children live. So again, if you don't have that at-risk population, be it a child or a pregnant woman, then you don't have the exposed population. So the point of everything we do is to actually break that exposure cycle so that children and pregnant women are not being exposed to lead, whether we break it at the exposure point or whether we break it at the point that they actually ingest those lead, the lead itself. So I'm going to stop here. This is a good time for a break. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about children and what makes them particularly at risk for lead, and then talk about some of the ways they're exposed and where that lead comes from.
Welcome back to our program, Elevated Lead in Children, the Potential for Harm and Our Response to the Problem. Sureisha, if you would please continue with the second part of your presentation, and then we'll be hearing from Shanda Wilkins, who provides case management in the home for children with elevated lead.
Yes, thank you. So I've talked a little bit about why we do what we do and breaking that exposure pathway. So we're going to get more involved into how that affects children. So with the exposure risk for lead, children are particularly susceptible to the harm that lead causes, especially children under 6. And there are several reasons for that. First of all, children do demonstrate a more frequent hand-to-mouth activities type thing, and they have a higher rate of absorption. They are also, unlike adults, not as efficient at removing toxins from their body. And their brains are in a very rapid stage of development, particularly at the younger ages. So they're much more susceptible to those neurological effects since they are in that stage of development. In addition, children who are birthed to 2 years and spend a large percentage of time in housing built before 1950, or children living in poverty, victims of abuse and neglect, and even immigrants that have been adopted from other countries, those are all populations at risk. And we do on occasion see children that have been adopted from other countries that have considerably higher lead levels than what we see just in our elevated lead levels day to day with children that are born here. In addition, children with developmental delays, and this one I find particularly interesting, that is a at-risk group only because in one of the cases that we followed, we had a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old had an elevated lead, and the elevated lead got as high as 49. All the while, the 5-year-old sister has been ignored in the testing, and I hate to say ignored, but 6 months passed before they tested the 5-year-old sister. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but in doing some investigating, find out that this 5-year-old sister had some developmental delays, and she demonstrated pica behavior, which is where you eat a non-food item, and so she would eat anything that was cotton. And so when they tested the 5-year-old sister, she also had an elevated lead, even though she was out of what is considered the highest age group for risk. She still was demonstrating those behaviors, not quite hand-to-mouth, but the fact that she was eating those non-food items. So really important to consider that when you look at risk factors. In addition to that, children with caregivers remodeling a home built before 1978, or with parents in a occupation that leads them to lead exposure. And then, of course, if a sibling or playmate is diagnosed with lead poisoning, it is important that we look at the other children in the home and see, look and see if others need to be tested based on age and behaviors and the exposures that they are having similar to the playmate or sibling that already has the elevated lead. So this may look familiar, but we're going to get a little more in depth on the routes of exposure. There are 3 primary routes of exposure we're going to talk about. There is another type of lead. There's organic and inorganic lead. Organic lead is the tetraethyl lead that was once in gasoline that, thank goodness, has been essentially removed from gasoline and does not pose a risk from our cars now. That one can actually be absorbed through the skin, but we're going to talk about inorganic lead, and with that, it's not something that would absorb through the skin. So the 3 main ways that exposure could occur would be through ingestion, through inhalation, and through transplacental exposure. So with ingestion, I think we've covered that one pretty well already, but with children, it's that hand-to-mouth activity. It could be bad habits with food prep, maybe not good hand washing before prepping food. But again, for children, it's that hand-to-mouth activity. And again, what Stephen talked about, how lead paint chips have that sweet taste that appealed to children once they tasted it. Inhalation is another possible way to be exposed to lead. I once heard somebody say it had never occurred to me, but children are smaller people, so they're closer to the ground. So if you have a home that has a lot of lead dust on the floor and it gets stirred up, they're going to be more likely to inhale that lead dust than what, someone 5'6" to 6 feet would. So that makes a big difference there. And then, of course, with lead industry, if you have in urban areas, homes in urban areas, they are exposed to more of those industrial contaminants that come from all the different factories you see in those types of areas. The one I want to highlight off this, though, for this particular reason is the placental exposure, and that is because of how that can occur. So intrauterine exposure can actually occur due to a mother's past or present exposure. So if a mom is currently being exposed to lead and she tests positive, then it is something we can address. We can immediately address where the mother is getting the lead from, and Shanda may touch on that a little bit too, because there are some unusual habits sometimes that you see in pregnant women that expose them to lead. On the other hand, lead in a mother's body could potentially come from a past exposure. And how that occurs is that lead, if there's chronic exposure in the past, can actually mineralize in the bones. And pregnancy puts the body in a certain state of stress. So what actually occurs is that stress causes the bone to release some of that lead back into the bloodstream. And so although the mother has no current exposure to lead, you now have lead circulating in mom's blood, and the baby is going to get some of that through the placenta. So that is very, very tricky thing to deal with. It is important that obstetricians are testing mothers when they're pregnant and monitoring that if it appears to be an issue, because that can affect a baby's development before they're ever even born. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the symptoms that you see with lead exposure. So what I touched on at the beginning, talked more about the high lead level effects, but you even have symptoms at low concentrations with lead. It can affect the central nervous system, the kidneys, and the reproductive system. It can cause learning disabilities, behavioral problems. You can have decreased growth, and it can even lead to hearing loss. And that goes into that's part of the neurological effects you can see. What I'm not talking about, but you can also see, is that later in life, if children are exposed early, you can also see an increase in kidney problems, reproductive problems. It can decrease sperm count and can cause low birth weights. So other things that you would see with that. But the key thing with this is with low exposure of lead and low levels of lead, you frequently see no obvious symptoms until later, when it manifests in some type of behavioral problems. Now, with higher concentrations of lead, this is where you see what is historically thought of as lead poisoning. And you can see that abdominal pain and colic, the kidney damage, the anemia, and then, of course, the potential for coma, seizures, and death. And those would be very high levels that you would see that happen. The key thing to know about this, and this is why we want to interrupt that exposure pathway, break it, and completely prevent the exposure, is because the damage from that elevated blood lead level is permanent. And it will continue to affect a child for the rest of their life if it occurs. But the impact can be lessened if we can at least stop it there. And that is why the testing is so important at 12 and 24 months of age. Because between 12 and 24 months of age is when children become ambulatory and really can begin to get into all those things that you're able to keep them out of before that. And they're putting everything in their mouth. So it's really, really important to know that we're trying to stop it in its tracks and not let those permanent effects occur. And while I'm not going to go greatly in detail on this, the main thing to take away here is that lead exposure and lead poisoning has the potential to affect every system in the body. So even though we're focused on the neurological aspects of it, there's so much more that comes with that. And that is because your brain is your control center. So when you affect your neurological system, it's going to affect everything. So you can see a little overlap here, but we're going to talk more about the sources of lead that are in the home. Lead-based paint, as Stephen said, is the primary source of lead here in Alabama. And as he said, that was banned in 1978 for use in homes and child-occupied facilities. Today, there are approximately 24 million housing units that have deteriorated lead-based paint and dust, and over 4 million of those homes have one or more young children in them. And he touched on this already, but the takeaway on this is to make sure the paint is well maintained, that you're not doing renovations yourself, because again, you disturb the paint, you spread more lead, and you actually can increase the risk for exposure instead of decreasing it. And this is actually a picture taken somewhere here in Alabama, and you can see how badly the outside paint is peeling and chipping. And so, of course, not only is it on the house where a child might pick at it and try and eat it if they're outside playing, but being in a windowsill like that, it's also going to get in that soil at the edge of the home and contaminate the soil as well. And kids like to play in the dirt. So that's actually two different ways a child could get it from this one place where there's lead. So again, those flakes or chips, they will deteriorate into an invisible dust. And so it is very, very important that it's maintained or covered up so that children can't be exposed to it. So our secondary sources of lead, and there's a lot of these. If y'all haven't gathered already, lead is found everywhere. We've used lead historically in all sorts of industry, and so it's just a natural part of our environment. It's not going anywhere. We just need to know how to deal with it. So secondary sources of lead could be things like pottery and ceramics. You have glazes that are made with lead, and even some imported pottery, the clay itself is going to have lead in it. So it's very important that it's not used for food or beverage items, because the lead can leach into those items and then be ingested when people eat and drink it. older or imported mini blinds. And I know I've seen on more than one occasion with an environmental inspection that had been done that that the mini blinds, one of the recommendations was to replace the mini blinds because of that reason. And then older outdoor playground equipment, while most places I'd go that would have that type of thing, I couldn't tell you how old it is. The big thing would be not to let children play on equipment that has chipping or peeling paint. Again, not knowing if it's lead paint or not, it's another exposure source for children. Candy from Mexico is one that comes up a lot. And part of that is because of the wrappers that they use has certain dyes in it that they use on the wrapper for the markings that can actually contain lead and leach into the candy. And then, of course, one of them that I think we've touched on a little bit, but exposure from a caregiver's job or a hobby. And that could be anywhere from battery recycling to smelting to, I love to go fishing and I like to get these little lead weights. And I have seen this, I grew up watching this. You get those little lead weights that just smash on your line, and what's the easiest way to get them on in there? People bite them with their teeth. You don't want to do that. That's nothing but lead. Stained glass also is a source of lead. That is lead in that glass and I call it solder, but the separation in the panes. So those are all possible sources of lead. In addition, toys, cosmetics, and again, that airborne lead from nearby industries. So again, that's more of a risk for an urban area as opposed to somewhere more rural. Your cosmetics are often your imported cosmetics. And your toys, it could be imported. It could be something that the toy is painted with. I will tell you, and I learned this personally myself because I bought this cute little bird whistle for my granddaughter when I was on a trip in Mexico. And after I took this job and started learning about lead, it went up on a shelf and she's never touched it again because you just don't know when you're getting those imported products. They're not going through the same types of, it's not as stringent the way they do things in other countries. So all to be considered. And that also covers jewelry, unregulated spices. We have a lot of, we're the great melting pot. We have a lot of different cultures in our nation now. And when people go back to their home country and visit relatives, a lot of times they'll bring back spices, they'll bring back home remedies with them. And some of those, many of those have not gone through the same regulations that we have here. So there are instances where they are contaminated with lead. This did not happen here, but in talking with other states, there was an incident where a family went home and visited a grandmother, and she grew her own turmeric. And lo and behold, the soil was contaminated, therefore the spice was contaminated, and they were bringing lead back home when they came back and had no idea. So again, really important to know that whatever you're using, anything you ingest is going through a proper process before you use it. And that applies to the traditional folk medicine as well.
And one reason, Saray, in these other countries we see the higher lead in those type of products is because leaded gasoline is still legal. Where we have unleaded gasoline in America, these other countries still put that triethyl lead in their gasoline, so it's still a big, huge contaminant to the soil.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. Yes. So other sources of lead, you have keys. What child doesn't love to chew on keys? Don't let them chew on your keys. That's another place that they could be picking up lead. Art and craft supplies. Even though we have removed lead from house paints, there are still art supplies that you will find lead in the paint because it does produce such vibrant colors. So it's really important to know that you're getting art and craft supplies that don't have lead in them, or you're not letting small children use those. And then, of course, your contaminated drinking water. And that can vary based on the fixtures in your home, the pipes coming into your home, or even the supply lines that come from your water company. And if you're on well water, again, it could depend on what kind of groundwater you've got, and again, the pipes coming in. And let me go back. One thing that I do not have on my secondary sources of lead that I have come across recently, and this is a double plug for public health, the fact that you can get lead from secondhand smoke. So it's another good reason to not start smoking, or if you smoke now, to work to stop smoking. Because again, if you have children in your home, and even for the adults in your home, that's a lead exposure that's occurring because of the lead that could potentially be in that tobacco. So we're going to talk a little bit about the detection of lead hazards. We occasionally get calls, people just out of the blue want to get their homes tested. And while there's only a couple of kits that are certified for this type of testing, you can get a do-it-yourself chemical spot test. But the catch with that is you have to really follow the instructions, because as Stephen has explained to me, it can only test for surface lead. So if you have lead paint in your home, but it is encapsulated or painted over, then if you use that to test that wall, you're not going to pick up the lead paint unless you actually score the surface a little bit and actually test what is underneath that paint. So the recommendation is always going to be to, for more accurate testing your home, is to consult a qualified lead professional. And so these are some numbers for Stephen's program. And actually at this point, I wanted to ask Stephen a little bit, if he would tell us a little bit about the certification program and if kind of what that entails for people actually being certified to do lead testing in the home.
Yeah, sure. Now, our staff, I mean, just to do what we do, we have to have the same credential as the people that we license and regulate. So all of our staff, including myself, have to go through a training course to be certified. We have to go and get licensed ourselves to be licensed inspectors and risk assessors, and this is all regulated by the Environmental Protection Agency, following their guidelines for training. So everyone that we license and certify as far as companies that do lead inspections and lead and risk assessments on homes, they have to go through it's a 3-day training course with hands-on experience in that prospective category. So if it's an inspector class, they'll go through that class, and it has so many hours of classroom requirements, so many hours of hands-on training in that class. Once they've taken the class, passed the test, then they have to go and get accredited. It's almost like getting a driver's license. They will go and get accredited with our partner, the University of Alabama Safe State, and that just means that they took a class from an approved training provider, that they did pass the test, and now they've passed our test, saying that you are skilled at what you do. So once they get that individual accreditation, then they come to us with public health and get their firm certified. So that requires an application, and there's a lot of I guess cross-checking of information. So when we get that application from a firm or a company wanting to do renovation or abatement, we verify all those things. They went through that accredited training provider. Here's their training or renovator number that they've got as accreditation, and now we're going to issue that company a license to do work on lead. So that's why it's so important to hire that professional, is because they know the safe practices, they know how to look for lead, they know what all the areas are where lead could be an issue in someone's home.
Okay. How long is that certification good for? Is there a time period on it?
The training that they go through, the training class that they take, is good for 3 years. And as long as they maintain that training with a refresher course before that 3 years is up, then they're good for 3 years, and they take a refresher, they're good for another 3 years. But if they let that lapse, then they got to start all over. So for an inspector risk assessor to tell you how hard that would be on them, they can't just say, oh, I forgot my training, I need to take a class to get my training back. No, they've got to start back over. So they've got to become an inspector, get that training done and certified, and then they can become a risk assessor to do that work. Same thing with a renovator. They would have to retake that class if they let that expire. Now, their certification or license with the health department is good for 1 year. But since their training is good for 3 years, we do give companies an option where they could pay for a 3-year license versus a 1 year.
Okay. All right.
But it is annual. Most all these companies choose to operate on an annual renewal basis.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get a little more into lead hazards. We've really kind of brushed over them, but we're going to get a little more in detail and then talk a little bit more about what we can do to actually reduce or remove those lead hazards. So we've talked about homes built before 1978. Of course, I know it's been said several times to paint over or encapsulate the lead paint and ensure it stays in good repair. With a home with a child in it, if you're in a position where if someone can't immediately repair or paint over the paint, you can use contact paper, duct tape, or even furniture to block a child's access to that area. And it's really important, if you know you have lead paint on your windows, to limit the use of windows, because just the friction of opening and closing the windows can produce more lead dust than it would just not doing that. And like we said, using a certified lead contractor for renovations. If you're in an area with a that's near heavy traffic or lead industry, you want to be sure that you have some ground cover around the home, grass or mulch, so that you don't have a lot of exposed soil. Because again, exposed soil, if kids get out and play, they can get into that, or just tracking it on your shoes into your home, because we know that lead settles in the soil, particularly closer to the home's perimeter. And then, of course, if you've got play areas for kids outside, you want to make sure that it also has some ground cover on it, and you want to make sure it's not right against the structure of the home. There was a mother that I listened to talk, and her child had a moderately high lead levels in the 20s. And ultimately what happened when he was 2 to 3 years old, he had a sandbox that she put out in the back of the house for him to play in, and unknowingly put it right up next to siding where lead-based paint was chipping right off in his sandbox. And so he was getting exposed through that playing in the sand. So it's important to keep that away from the home so that you're not in those higher concentrations of lead. And then, of course, like I talked about with the soil, just removing the shoes upon entering the home, and that's less lead dust that will be brought into the home. In addition, water being a source, it's important to run the cold water at least 30 seconds before use. If you prefer not even to risk that, you can actually do bottled water, or there are certain water filter systems that are certified to actually filter out the lead, so you're not getting lead in your water at all. It is important to note that unlike certain other infectious agents, boiling water is not going to get rid of the lead. The lead will still be there after you boil the water, so that would not be effective against lead. As far as imported herbal remedies and spices, really the best thing to do is to avoid those altogether, because you just don't know which ones are going to potentially be contaminated with lead and which ones won't. And then food storage, this gets a little bit into the ceramic and pottery, and that is the fact that you want to make sure you're not using items for food storage that contain lead, because again, the lead can leach into the food and the beverage. It's also important, even if you're buying items from a retail store, that you're reading those labels and making sure they're safe for food storage. And a really good example of this, and this was many, many Christmases ago, I had bought a set of chargers, which are the big decorative plates that go under your plates, and it was beautiful, beautiful Christmas design. But it was made for a plate to go on it, and it very clearly stated on the bottom of it, even though it was a charger for a plate, that it was not intended for direct food contact. And again, it had that lovely lead glaze that made it very, very pretty to look at. So very important to read labels before you use anything for food storage.
And before you get off the water slide, I wanted to point one other thing out, Saracia, was that in Alabama, we have very safe water. So like the video that you saw earlier, highlighted Michigan replacing or New Jersey replacing all their service lines. Well, Alabama has done a really good job through the Alabama Department of Environmental Management of monitoring lead and lead in water where it hasn't really been an issue. So, I mean, we've really never seen contamination of lead from a water supplier. But now, where we do see lead in water, typically, it could be a service line that, maybe just didn't get replaced in Alabama, but it's most likely is the plumbing within the home. So the older the home, the more likely it's going to have lead soldering joints and fixtures under the home for the piping. So you got a house built 1950 or before, chances are you have some type of lead pipes or soldering joints in your home.
Okay, and I've even seen brass fixtures could be an issue too. So
yes, because they use the solder to put those fixtures together.
Okay. Mm-hmm. In addition, art materials, and I know I've already said all this, but you don't want young children to use any lead-containing art supplies. So it's really important that you make sure what you're letting small children use contains no lead, and even older children and adults, if you're using art supplies, it's really important to wash your hands when handling, so that if there is lead in that, you're not spreading it or contaminating other surfaces. And toys are a little tricky, but just staying current on recalls can help keep track if you've got toys that could potentially be a lead risk. And again, imported toys, like I talked about earlier, you don't want to bring something home that's got all this really vibrant paint on it from some travel abroad, not knowing whether there's lead paint on that or not. So, of course, children love the playground as well, and they have their play areas. So you, again, want to avoid any playground equipment that has peeling or chipping paint, and encourage children to play away from areas of bare soil. So if you have like a swing set or a little playhouse out in the yard, it's important that those are put in a grassy area or an area where you've put down some mulch or some other ground cover so that children aren't in that bare soil playing. And of course, I'm not going to read them all, but the main thing to take away here is it's really important that if you're in one of these jobs, or if a family member is in a job that is known to be a lead exposure risk, that they're following proper procedures. So before leaving the job, they should be changing, showering, because lead can come home on the skin, the hair, the clothes, the shoes, and even the tools. And more importantly, and we've seen this happen, that they're thinking that if they just take clothes off outside the home or like in the mud room where the child doesn't go and wash clothes separately, that they are taking care of it. But they've put lead in their vehicle if they haven't taken the proper procedures before they actually left their job. Because even if they're keeping it out of the home, they're still getting it in the vehicle. If the child's got a car seat in the vehicle, then you're getting it on the car seat. So the child is still being exposed even if it's not actually in the home environment. So really, really important that individuals are aware if they are in a job that involves lead. And it's the same with the hobbies. Hobbies are can be a little trickier because a lot of times people are doing these at home. And so with hobbies, the important thing is this, and even with occupations, if someone is doing some type of work in the home that involves lead exposure, it's really important that that area is completely separated from any of the living area, anywhere the child would go. And that good cleanup is practiced when that hobby or that work is done. Because again, the lead dust can spread and children will get in it. They'll find a way to get in it if it's there to be exposed to. And then some basic things that can just be done around the house. And it's something that anytime somebody calls and says, hey, what can I do to fix this? These are the suggestions that they will always get. Cleanliness around the house. Because we know that lead dust is invisible and can settle on windowsills and on the floors and on the furniture, to mop and use a damp cloth around windows and doors at least twice a week. And that helps to keep the lead dust low. And then in addition to that, making sure that toys and pacifiers are cleaned regularly to remove any lead dust that may be on them. And it's really important to note that the 3-second rule cannot apply here because, again, anything that hits the floor, if there's lead dust in the home, has the potential to pick up lead dust. So, in addition to that, personal hygiene. So that's that hand washing. I think hand washing in public health applies in everything we do. But frequent hand washing, especially before eating or napping and after playing. And this, of course, even applies to adults. When you're preparing food, make sure you've washed your hands before you start preparing food. Because, again, if you do have some lead in your home that you know is there, or even if you don't know it's there, if it gets on your hands before you prepare food, then you've just put the lead right in your food. Diet is one, and I haven't talked a lot about this yet, but diet is really a very important one. We know that a child with an empty stomach can absorb up to 100% of the lead that they ingest. And you can decrease that by half just by making sure that they've got the appropriate diet. So when you talk about diet, you want children to have low-fat diets that are high in calcium, iron, and vitamin C. Your calcium is another metal just like lead. And what happens with calcium, if you've got a high calcium diet, then that calcium is what the body's absorbing to build the bones and to build the teeth, for blood use in blood synthesis, for different neurological processes. But if the child's not getting that calcium, lead functions very similar in the body to calcium. And it will bind in the places calcium would have binded if it had been there and go to all those same places, but it unfortunately cannot do the same functions that calcium can. And this is actually one of the reasons you see the neurological impacts from lead is because without the calcium in the body, the lead does just trying to do what the calcium does for the brain, and it just can't do it. Iron, very similar. Iron, more or less about how it does in the body and how it does through the gastrointestinal tract. The more iron that a child is getting in their diet, the less lead that they are able actually to absorb from the gastrointestinal tract. So really important they're getting that iron in their diet. And then, of course, your vitamin C just helps with the absorption of iron. So very important and sometimes difficult with a picky 2-year-old, but the more you can get in them that matches this diet right here, the less lead they will absorb even if there is exposure to it. And then lastly, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but chelation is the only therapy for lead. And it should be very selective in how it's used. It's generally only used for lead levels above 45 micrograms per deciliter. There may be times that it would be used for levels less than 45 micrograms per deciliter if you've got a persistent high lead level that's just not coming down. The thing to understand about this is, first of all, specialists should be involved. You should have a pediatric toxicologist or be consulting with a pediatric environmental health specialty unit, because in addition to pulling the lead out of the body, that chelation is also going to pull really important minerals the body actually needs, including the calcium. So again, chelation doesn't stop the damage that lead poisoning or lead exposure has caused already. It can halt any more damage from being done, but that's one of those things that's always just got to weigh the benefits with the risk. There are rare cases where it's better to do it than not do it, but that would be in consultation with someone that's an expert on the matter. So the main thing to know, again, you can't reverse the health effects of lead poisoning, but you can decrease further damage. And our goal in breaking that exposure pathway is primary prevention through identification and elimination of lead exposure sources. So again, that is why if we see one child that has been exposed in a home, we want to make sure there are not others also having that. And the video said it, and I don't know that I've said it specifically yet, but it's really important to note there is no known safe level of blood lead. We talk about 5 micrograms per deciliter, but I can't say enough that even 1 is too much. So in summary, our primary source of lead for children is the lead-based paint you find in older homes built before '78. And that primary route of exposure is generally the hand-to-mouth activity through the ingestion through that. You've got a lot of common secondary sources. Parent jobs are very common. Excuse me. Get choked up right at the end. Art and craft supplies. Woo. So sorry. I'm not even going to try and read it.
Well, if you need a break, I just want to let you know, 10 years ago, the #1 source of lead in Alabama was mini blinds, plastic mini blinds. So to show you how, how tough the problem is with lead, because it's everywhere, we're still battling lead. But we beat the mini blind battle because it was fairly inexpensive and an easy choice for a parent, homeowner, landlord to make. I'm going to get rid of these plastic mini blinds and put up curtains, or I'm going to get rid of these mini blinds and put up some other cheap mini blinds that aren't these plastic ones that don't have the lead. So we still see lead in mini blinds, but it's not like it was 10 years ago when it was the #1 cause of lead poisoning in Alabama. I mean, in children, we've got pictures of kids, literally while we're there, eating it like it's a piece of candy, or you can see their teeth marks embedded into the mini blind where they're just sitting there gnawing and chewing on these mini blinds. So that's just a good, opportunity to show that, you can start eliminating and help this problem, with the right motivation. And with the mini blinds, people are able to do that and afford it to do it.
Thank you. Yeah. So also, lead exposure in children has the highest impact on the central nervous system, especially that brain development. And as we know, children under 6 are considered most at risk because they demonstrate the hand-to-mouth behaviors, have the higher rate of absorption. They are less efficient at removing toxins from their body, and they are in a more rapid stage of development. And of course, the only way to confirm lead poisoning is through blood lead testing, preferably a venous blood lead test. But we can reduce blood lead through good hand washing, a good diet, maintaining your the paint in a home built before 1978, and just making sure that we're mopping and damp dusting at least a couple of times a week in the home. Most importantly, there is no known safe blood lead level. Even if we are not following it because it's less than 5, if there is ever a child that has a result that is anything above 0, I encourage I encourage follow-up of that. I encourage continuing to monitor that to make sure that does not become a problem, and educating the family on things they can do to eliminate that little bit of lead exposure that has already occurred. And that does it for me. I will hand it over to you, Shanda.
Thank you. Like they said, I'm Shanda Wilkins. I'm care coordinator in Pike County, where I have worked lead cases now for probably 20-something years. Our county is unique in that our primary source of lead, we have a battery smelting plant in the county that employs a large number of individuals. So that, over the course of my time, has been the primary source of lead. I've seen all of the other sources that we've been hearing about today. Lead to me is particularly interesting. It's detailed. We've heard from an environmentalist, we've heard from a nurse, somewhat almost intimidating as a social worker, I'll admit, when I started this, because you're not just using case management skills to do an assessment. You have to put on an environmental hat, somewhat learn from the nurses, all of those other specialties that we're lucky enough to have communication with. But when we're out in the home, especially those cases that are referred to us when the lead level is between a 5 and a 14, because if you'll remember, the environmentalist doesn't come out usually until it reaches a 15. So I like that. I like the challenge in finding out where the lead's coming from, the fact that it's preventable with education, proper follow-up, seeing the lead levels go down in these kids. That's when I say I like lead poisoning, I like case management for lead poisoning because of that, because I can see immediately the difference that is being made with these families. Part of what I've been asked to talk today about is more stories, experience type things. You'll see from the presentation, a lot of our information has overlapped, and we were laughing before we started. It goes to show the importance of this, because we all, as an environmental, as a nurse, as a social worker, we've all included it in our presentation. The fact that children are more likely to be exposed because they're closer to the floor, because they put everything in their mouth, because it affects children more than it does adults. Lead affects all major body organs. In my 20-something years of providing case management, I've been fortunate enough to work with all populations, and I can remember working with an elderly male who was end-stage kidney disease and going to dialysis 3 times a week, and they attributed his kidney failure to his prolonged exposure at a local lead plant, and it had shut his kidneys down. I've seen children who had moderately low lead levels as a child whose parents call when they get ready for school, and the teacher or counselor has called them in for a parent-teacher conference because they're wanting to test them for special education classes. My coworkers laugh at me, but I do. I read the daily newspaper and I check up with where our folks are, and unfortunately a lot of the males that I see in the newspaper with not on the jail log, I'll just say, are people that I've worked with over the past 20-something years who had elevated lead levels, as children. So I've seen what it can do to children and families. So that's my take on today. Of course, the damage that it's caused is irreversible, like Suresh and Stephen both mentioned. When we are assigned a lead referral, typically they do come from CCRS. In rare instances, the pediatrician office may call, or even a mom may call before CCRS even has time to get everything entered in and say, hey, my doctor said that my child has an elevated lead level. But the assessment begins before we even leave the office. One of the first things that I do when given the address, just a typical internet search, typing in the address, various search options pop up, and it'll tell you the year built for the house. I would say that those are not always 100% accurate. Each county has their own GIS system where they do the land appraisal, the house appraisal. Those are usually very exact if your county has access to that. So before I even go out to do the visit, I know a general idea what year the house was built. And because so many of the families that I work with, they're renters, I'll be honest, I've met many of families who don't even know the landlord's name. They'll say where he comes by, around the 5th of the month and gets my check or whatever, and I just make it out to so-and-so. So I like to know who the landlord is too, because it could be relevant on down the line, especially if the environmentalist has to come out. So that's kind of pre-assessment type things. I like that I think we've all used the same picture of the peel and paint, but pulling into the driveway, my assessment's continuing. I'm checking the repairs on the house, if there's peel and paint, if there's a car that dad or mom's boyfriend or granddad may be working on in the yard. And I've seen engines inside of houses. I've seen tires inside of houses because the family was afraid that they would get stolen and the kids had stacked the tires on top of each other, like making a toy. I mean, they were climbing on it. So all of that, these are things that you're assessing for. The mini blinds, that other than the dad's occupation, that would probably be my next biggest source of exposure for Pike County. And Stephen mentioned just a few minutes ago, you can tell automatically the mini blinds are usually pulled back. You'll see teeth and marks, and typically there's a couch or a chair in front of it. And the kids, when you knock on the door, will even peer through the windows to see who's there. And of course, their hands are going straight into their mouth. The picture of the fishing sinkers, we'll talk more about that too. But in my mind, just doing the general assessment and overview of the house. Another thing I want to mention is the location of the house. If it's located close to a busy highway, that's something to keep in mind, because when lead was still in gasolines, if the house is close to the road and the kids play in the yard, then we may have the potential for the lead to be in the soil there. So again, that's wearing all the hats that we've covered today and just a general assessment before you've really even asked any specific questions of the family. My message to the caregiver, I go ahead, some of the words that we've used today and the details of it, I mentioned that it was intimidating. It's over my head a lot of times. But I just go ahead, and my message is I use the word lead poisoning. I say, your child has lead poisoning, and I would like to set up a time to come out so we can find out where it's coming from, and I've got information to give you on ways to help to get their lead level down. What time is good for you? Do you prefer morning or afternoon? I don't necessarily say, can I come out? I just give them what time is best for you, morning or afternoon, and then they have accepted and agreed to me coming out to the home. And using the term lead poisoning, because when a parent hears the word poisoning, I found that I have their attention better than if I say they have an elevated lead level. Well, what does that mean? So it's real important just to get your foot in the door and have their attention, and stressing that there may not be any symptoms initially. They covered the age range that the tests are usually done in at 12 and 24 months. Well, what 2-year-old is not hyper, what 2-year-old is not throwing temper tantrums during the visit, and they say, oh, well, that's just normal. But once they get to be school age and that damage has been done and they're having to be tested for special education, but to get this message across was important about this initial visit and initial contact. Why there's an immediate need to reduce lead exposure, explaining that the damage is irreversible. And I've read studies that show, and if they just take the mean lead level of a child at 8, and it can fluctuate to or from, but with an average lead level of 8, that can account for a 3.9 point IQ drop in a child. An average lead level of 8 can cause ADHD, hearing loss, other conduct disorders, and lead to juvenile criminal offenses as well. So once that is done, and I try to stress that as seriously as I can and give real life stories. I talk about possible sources of lead exposure. You know, I'm right off asking what everybody in the household, what occupations, whether it's auto body repair work, if they work in construction, hobbies, if they fish, if they hunt. So I'm taking all this in during my initial visit and talk about ways to reduce exposure. The information that we covered today is overwhelming to me because there's so many aspects of it, and I've learned that the goal of the first visit is not to overwhelm the parent, but is to get their attention and to convince them that they can trust you, that you can help them, that this is a very serious problem, and that with your help, with our help, that we're going to help this child's lead level get down as quick as possible. So, like I said, it's important not to overwhelm them. We've got a lot of great brochures and informational materials to share with them. I've been on visits before where they're just handed a pile of papers. That's great, but you know, based on your interaction with a family, how much they need at one time, and you may have to break it down. But the first visit, you want them to know how serious this is and that it can be fixed. You're going to talk to them, you know, your child's going to have to go for follow-up testing. This is important because we've got to know if the information that we're covering, if taking down the mini blinds, if that's helping, because we've got to be able to measure. We want to see these lead levels going down. Generally, I think Saracia mentioned what most of the lead levels are that we deal with, and those fall in with a 3-month time frame for repeat. As care coordinator, we're tracking that, we're monitoring it. I found that even though a lot of pediatrician offices are good about keeping the schedule as to when they come back, many of them depend on us to say, well, when do they need to come back for another test? So that's a primary responsibility of ours. And we also want to monitor the child's developmental conditions. I know when with a young child and somebody will say, well, how old is she? Well, she's 9 months. And somebody say, well, why don't you just say she's almost a year? Well, the difference in a 9-month-old and a 12-month-old, they're huge. And then as you start getting to 12 months and 15 months, but we're looking for very specific milestones that these children are supposed to be meeting at those intervals. And so through our follow-up, we're going to be working with the parents and making sure that these kids, and the pediatricians as well, that they are meeting these milestones and that their exposure to lead has not already started affecting that. We've talked about this so much. The houses built prior to 78, you'll see 1978 and 1950 used in a lot of our educational material. And basically what I've kind of figured out, if a house was built prior to 78, there's a pretty good chance that there's going to be some lead paint in there. If it was built prior to 1950, you can bet on it, just about, that there's going to be lead paint. Is that right, Stephen?
Yes, that's correct. Pre-78, that's when they outlawed lead-based paint. But typically where it was utilized was on those high friction areas, doors, windows, So that's usually where you see it in those 78 homes.
Right.
But in pre-1950, it was used inside, outside, exterior, interior. It was baseboards. It was used all over.
Right. So if you've wondered about that, if you've noticed, if you've seen some of the information, say 78, some 50, but I just use 78 as a general rule. And when I'm doing my research before going out, I'm looking to see what year the dwelling was built. I have not worked with many families over the years who actually own the home themselves. Most of mine have been rental property. So again, these common sources that we've talked about, in my years, I've only seen one test come back on water that the water level was high, but the environmentalists tested every faucet within the house. It was a mobile home. In the back bedroom, they had used it as a storage room, and there was a bathroom off of it, and the mom couldn't even remember the last time that they had turned the faucet on. Well, the water that they collected from that had lead in it, but the kid never drank from it. It was just the testing. So I can honestly say that we're blessed in Alabama with good water for the most part, I guess. Toys and jewelry, that's going to be probably my next biggest source of lead behind occupation, paint, mini blinds, and I'll talk some about that too. Imported food, the homemade remedies and cosmetics. It's amazing what all people do as far as homemade remedies. And when I started in this, I thought that maybe that was meant for people who had moved from other countries and they were doing stuff that they had learned in their home country. But especially being from rural South Alabama, the remedies that grandparents, grandmamas have passed down year after year, generation after generation. One of the examples that I share, Meredith likes, I went to do a visit one day and the mom was loading the kids up and the little boy had lead poisoning and they all had Walmart bags in their hand, and I was like, where are y'all going? And they were going to somewhere in the country beside the road that was supposed to have very iron-rich dirt to help with stomach cramps. Well, the soil was right next to a heavily traveled highway. And in my mind, I'm thinking, am I worried about the lead? Am I worried about the parasites? Am I worried about what all that this kid is about to take in? But he was having stomach cramps because of his elevated lead level. But when you start trying to figure out what comes first and what comes from, it can be interesting sometimes. The household products, cooking utensils, pottery, and again, mini blinds. And my daughter, interestingly enough, did her science fair project last year on lead. And we went to Walmart. I was looking around and I was wanting to test some of the mini blinds because my understanding is unless it has the seal on it saying that it's certified lead free, and they have them now so that children won't choke with the cords, that there's a chance that some of them may have lead in it. And so when the cashier checked us out, it made a beeping noise, and she said, I can't sell these to you. And I said, oh, why not? And she said, I really don't know what it means. And she called the manager over, and she said, well, there's a recall on these. And this was just this past school year, and I was like, I want to buy them anyway, because I just wanted to test them. But they wouldn't, and they had to dispose of them. So the mini blinds, they're still in the stores. This sheet right here, it shows toys from all generations. If you hear the word vintage in front of it in regard to toys, don't let your child play with it. It's pretty much my experience. We grew up with Fisher-Price, and Fisher-Price still makes a lot of toys, but all of the vintage Fisher-Price toys, the way that they have held their colors and withstood all these years is because of the lead paint in them. You'll see to the right there, there's a fidget spinner, and those were the craze several years ago. Well, most all of them have that metal in the middle of them, well, is, you know, kids 12 and above that don't put their fingers in their mouth, perhaps. But when there's younger siblings in the home, we actually had a family in Dothan, and the two kids had fidget spinners, and they kept them next to their bed, just on the little side table, and the side table was covered in lead dust, and their lead levels were very high. The bottom, starting from the left, is that Ernie? Ernie. Back in 2007, I remember going into Walmart, and the toy section was empty. There was nothing on the shelves. And Fisher-Price, they had a huge recall, and you can still see it now. I'll talk about the website in a minute, where pages and pages listing of toys were recalled because of the lead paint. It was back when Dora and Elmo. And what happens is those were recalled, so they were immediately taken off the shelf. Well, before doing this job, I didn't keep up daily with the recall notice. Grandma, who has toys, and it's passed down to the next grandkids, and you know, when we have kids, we pass our toys down to friends. So what I find is these are still out there. And so when I'm doing my home visit, that's one of the things that I do, and I found many of these toys that are still in the toy box or that the kids are still playing with.
And Shanda, even if it's not one of the toys that's been recalled, it's in a danger toy, I know I've seen that y'all ask this when I've been with you. You ask the parent or the guardian, does the child have a favorite toy they like to play with? So even if it's not a suspect toy, if it's a favorite toy, we're going to test it as environmentalists just to rule it out. Because we know that they're playing with it and putting it in their mouth.
Right. Because if it's imported and, you know, you run to some of these dollar stores and stuff and pick up a toy, those we find still do have lead paint in them, unfortunately. Some other sources, China, a lot of China. Of course, not a lot of the families that I work with eat off of China, but we have families that go to yard sales and Goodwill and pick up different pieces around and end up with these in their shelves. The middle stuff, that was Pottery Barn. That was a recall just a few years ago, and the paint on them had lead in them. And Sarisha touched on this. I've learned that the brighter the dishes at any of your major stores, if you turn it over, it usually does say for decorative purposes only, not for food consumption, and it's because of the lead paint. And of course, my family ate off of those dishes in the bottom right. I don't know about yours, but that probably explains a lot now, but they're still out there. And I use this to show that our assessments, we're assessing everything from the child's behavior to dad's occupation to other family members, down to what our families are eating off of, what the kids are playing with. These Shrek glasses, I went back and looked, and I don't want to misrepresent them. I think that they were actually recalled because of cadmium, but any of you a little bit older remember like the strawberry shortcake and the Smurf glasses and Hardee's and McDonald's, but those are still in big big demand now. I've looked on different eBay and stuff, and you can buy a lot of them, and they go for a lot of money, but they were all made with lead paint, and they're still out there. So I use this just to show you guys that there's so much more that we have to look for. The candy, I'm seeing more and more of that as our Hispanic population grows, and we have a lot of Hispanic stores that are popping up, and they have the food containers. I've done visits with environmentalists, and you can see on the box where it was manufactured. A lot of it was made in Mexico. The costume jewelry, and I just say it, Claire's, if it was made at Claire's, it doesn't need to, we don't need to if you have children, it's not a good idea to expose them to this jewelry because I give the example, you've got a child who's shy, and maybe they don't put everything in their mouth, but they're just timid, and first thing they're going to do is pick up what's around their neck and do like this. I've seen it so many times, and most all of that jewelry is made with lead. There's not a lot of regulations on it. Families who hunt, the bullets have lead. We have, of course, that's real common in South Alabama, and even young children go with dad and grandpa go hunting. I've seen studies too that shows the game that is killed from it, the deer and birds maybe who didn't die from the initial shot, later when they're killed and their body is harvested, that the meat is not recommended to eat because it's so full of lead because of the bullet that's been lodged in them. Some more sources, and I like to include all of this because what I've learned is so much thinking outside the box. It's not just, every case is totally different. I never know what I'm walking into. It's this type of work, it requires us to stay updated on recalls because recalls are coming out every day. This particular countertop covering, it was made by Rust-Oleum. It was recalled just last September 2018, and it was made for the countertop where food is prepared, and it exceeded the lead standards set forth by our government. The chest here was sold at Costco back in May 2014, not Costco, this was World Market. So what happens is you've got a toddler who's learning to pull up on furniture and holding on to things and then putting their hands into their mouth. Well, they're picking up the lead exposure, the lead paint from that. The water bottles, those were sold through Amazon and Costco back last year, and the pink paint on there, it was recalled because of the pink paint exceeding the limit. Even the wicker furniture down at the bottom that was sold through Pier 1, the paint exceeded the lead limits and they had to recall those. But just like I said, just because they were recalled, they were removed from the stores, but they've not been removed from the individual homes that we go to. Counseling and education, this is ongoing with our family members. There's no way that we can do it all within one visit. You want to discuss the long-term developmental issues, not only with the caregiver, but communicate with the child's provider, because when you're there in the home, we're going to see a lot more of how they're interacting, what their favorite toy is, what if there's mini blinds, what they're chewing on. And all of that information needs to be relayed to the doctor as well, and include elements that are specific to the child. I've worked with twins before, and one of them had a high lead level and the other one didn't. The one with a high lead level put every single thing he could touch into his mouth. The ethnic and cultural practices, I still see this a lot around some of our rural gas stations when you're checking out. In our hometown Piggly Wiggly, in the produce section, next to the onions and potatoes, they sell white dirt. And it says on there for decorative purposes only. I've never seen anybody decorate with a bag of white dirt. But it's usually bought for people who are exhibiting pica, who are eating non-food items and anemic, and they're craving those types of things. Well, because they're probably anemic because of the white dirt they're eating. But the dirt is almost, 100% lead. I find it interesting because I always look at, on the back, they'll have the website or a phone number, and those numbers and websites are always changing, I guess because, from my understanding, the government tries somewhat to track it, but they change their location and stuff so they can't be found. But those are real popular around my parts of the state. Identify all places where the child spends time. I've done as many as 3 home visits on one child before, because if mom and dad work, maybe the mom worked at night, dad works at day. So I did that house. They would stay with the paternal grandmother some and the maternal grandmother some. And it took all 3 places before we were able to identify the source of the lead. But it is important you, of course, start first with the child with the person who regularly cares for the child, and go from there. Again, many caregivers don't see the need to take action when they don't see the immediate symptoms. But again, through our education and the information, we have to get the point across to them that this is serious, and that without the follow-up, then the damage is going to be done and it's not going to be reversible. It's important to know how to spot the potential sources of exposure, and I'm mainly, again, referencing those cases where we're the only ones going out there, the lead levels that are between a 5 and a 14. The family needs to understand that they can reduce the lead exposure. It's very frustrating to know that you've provided all of this information. You know, things like the mini blinds, that's relatively easy, because if we know that it's the mini blinds, educate on how to take them down, and I'll cover that in case you do encounter mini blinds. It's important to pull any toys, furniture away from the windowsill, to go ahead and get just a big garbage bag before you even start. Contain the mini blinds, pull them all the way to the top to contain them, and put them directly into the garbage bag, remove them from the home, and have a small mop bucket there with the sudsy solution, and wipe out the window sills and the windows there. If any toys were underneath that, they'll need to be wiped down as well. Replacing the mini blinds, that may not be something that the family can afford at this time. They can use sheets to cover the window. This is when our social work skills come into play. If they're renting a house and the lead paint, if you see that it's chipping off, if they have a large piece of furniture, the TV that they can put in front of it, I've seen duct tape used, anything to contain that paint that's peeling off where the child is piecing it and pulling it apart. Those are things that we have to do. It's not always a good idea to involve the landlord. That's a question that'll be very patient specific, determine what the relationship is like between the family and the landlord, because it's much easier to help a family that has a home than help a homeless family, and that's the last thing that we want to do, because I've learned that landlords maybe have been understanding in the past if the family pays a day or 2 late, but if we're calling saying, hey, you know, the mini blinds have tested high for lead, then all of a sudden they may decide, well, I need to get them on out, and then we're looking at having to find somewhere for this family to move, and that wasn't part of the original case plan, and you've got a whole lot more problems then. So it's going to mean just working with each individual family. Following up with the PMPs, I'm going to be honest, that is one of the most challenging parts of the job. For me, many providers follow the recommendations set forth by ADPH that are in alignment with CDC, but many do their own protocol, and that's been frustrating. You know that. Y'all have heard that. But we are to advocate for our families, get to know your provider's office as well. They know my voice when I call, and if possible, when Stephen comes back in, if y'all could do a venous lead test. I educate the parents on that too, because if the doctor's hearing it from the parents also, in my mind I'm thinking that's got to help somewhat, because if the mom says, look, go ahead and do a venous test while we're here, because chances are if they do a capillary and it comes back elevated, the doctor's office is going to call them and say, hey, come back, we need to do a venous, which means mama's got to find a way to the doctor's office or take off work. So I've started telling the families too, I'm like, go ahead and just ask for a venous test, and it saves a lot of time. Tracking and monitoring, staying on top of it, making sure that they go back. And as you all know, a lot of the population that we work with, compliance is not a strength a lot of times. But with our phone calls and just dropping a letter in the mail saying, Saratia's going to need to have her lead repeated on September the 14th, make sure to keep this appointment. As you work these cases and you see that the lead levels are not dropping, you're going to know that there's some more education that's needed, and that's going to need to be additional home visits. Again, when I go out into the home, it's overwhelming. There's so much information to give them, but if you can break it down into shorter visits with a little bit of information here and there, I found that is a lot more beneficial to these families. We've gone over all these different ways to help reduce lead level, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. Something I've learned recently with Stephen and them doing the environmental inspection is the importance of running a clean cycle in the washing machine. If Dad or someone in the household works in an occupation that is a possible source of lead exposure, we educate them, wash his clothes by themselves, don't put anybody else's in there. But after they've removed, I've seen the environmentalists test the inside of the washing machine, and it'll have high, crazy numbers in there. So before putting children's clothes in there, we stress to them to wash out the inside of it. The lead diet is so important, and this can consume a whole visit. To say, well, give Meredith foods that have a lot of vitamin C and iron, but you've got to know the level of the family that we're working with. Give them specific foods, age-appropriate examples of foods, and that's something that it's going to be a change up because our families are used to frying foods, they're used to eating foods high in fat, but with this change in the diet, then we see the children's lead level go down, so that's why it's so important to do that. A lead case can be closed once there's been 2 consecutive tests with a level of below 5. Again, coordination with the doctor's office is very important because a lot of times they'll say, oh, well, we've got a 3. We don't have to do anything else, but, pick up the phone and say, can we just do one more just to make sure that it's staying below a 5 and hasn't gone back up. If there hadn't been any significant decrease after a year, and I would suggest even before then, go ahead and get your social work manager or director involved because they have a lot of good information. And, well, have you tried this, or let's do that? And if needed, they reach out to the state office and get other ideas and input on things that we can do. There's going to be other needs that we identify, transportation. All of that can be addressed through patient first care coordination if there's continued needs there after you've worked with a family to get their child's lead level down. I'm talking fast now. Does anybody have any questions?
So, do we have questions? Looks like we might have a minute and a half.
A minute and a half. I did pretty good.
We do not have any questions. I do want to ask a question of Shanda, though, just briefly. Do you have there been times when you've had to explain to community agencies or others working with children the importance of elevated lead?
Yes, because part of our protocol does involve the possibility of involving DHR. And I have met in our county with the DHR director, and they're like, well, I've heard about lead, I know about lead poisoning, but I'm not sure what all does this mean. It is an ongoing process. We have children that are removed from their parents and put into homes that have lead pain, and so I'm like, this foster placement is not a good placement. That is challenging because, you know, the director said, look, I'm trying to decide which fire is the hottest right now, and getting them out of a unsafe house versus putting them in a house with lead paint. But so I've spent a lot of time educating them on what it means long term. I mean, we're going to be dealing with this for years on down the road.
So it's not only educating families, it's educating schools, it's educating
Yes.
community agencies, DHR,
Yes.
and so forth.
And even we have a local, the psychiatrist who sees all of our children with ADHD. They call over and ask, do you think that this child needs a lead test? They've identified that this is a big problem and that the numbers of children with ADHD is increasing, and they've linked it to lead. So there's a lot of communication with them as well.
Thank you, Sarisha and Shanda and Stephen for participating today, and it was excellent information. This concludes our program for today, and I would also like to thank everyone for watching. It is also on demand. Please remember that you can refer back to the training and resources anytime on demand, and have a great day.